Hello, my name is Yahya and I am 32 years old now as I tell this story. We live in a village called Mazra e Koneh. My father was a farmer and my mother was a carpet weaver, but I was interested in my uncle's job. He was a desert driver. Eventually, after a lot of begging and insisting, my father agreed to let me pursue the job I loved. Of course, since I was their only child and they couldn't stand being away from me, I became a Nissan pickup driver. We would take the products from our village, which were mostly herbal distillates, to the city. Sometimes if someone placed an order, I would buy something from the city and bring it back. But my main business was that same wine. My story began when one of the old men in the village asked me to get something for him. Mashibad was an old man who worked as a gravedigger and lived near the cemetery. Since nobody in our village died year after year, he had a little roadside tea and breakfast stand. Whenever I went to the city, I would see him under the shade of a willow tree. The poor man's wife had died and he had no children. Sometimes the villagers would take him groceries and whatever else he needed. One day, as I was leaving the village, he raised his hand and I stopped. He slowly walked toward the truck. I greeted him and said, "What do you need, Mash?" He told me, "When you come back from the city, buy me 2 packages of pear tea." "Sure," I said and drove away. He usually didn't buy anything from the village grocery store. He said Khalil was a thief and his products were bad. To some extent, I agreed with him. Anyway, that day when I was coming back, Mash Ibad was still sitting by the road waiting for customers. I parked beside him and gave him the tea. He thanked me and paid for the items. I said, "Mash, pour me a cup of tea too." It was my habit to stop and drink a glass of tea with him whenever I came back from the city. Mashibad nodded and lifted the large teapot from the kettle. Suddenly, my eyes fell on the small teapot beside him. It was much cleaner and more beautiful than the large one. They called it a Shah Abbasi teapot. Jokingly, I said, "Mash, how about giving me some tea from your beautiful teapot for once?" He stopped what he was doing and stared directly into my eyes. It was as if I had offended him. Surprised, I said, "What happened, Mash?" While giving me a strange, unpleasant look, he said, "This teapot is for customers." To be honest, that hurt me. It wasn't like I was asking him for free tea. In fact, I wanted to help him. Still, I said nothing and pretended it didn't bother me, but his words stayed with me all day. That night, while we were sitting around the dinner table, my father noticed something was wrong and started questioning me. "Come on, tell me, what happened?" I told him, "There's something wrong with Mashibad." I made a joke with him and he answered me like that. My father immediately shook his head in surprise and said, "Leave the poor man alone. Ever since his wife died in that cemetery, he hasn't been right in the head. Sometimes he can't control himself." But I couldn't accept that explanation. I said, "A person is either sane or crazy. He can't be both. It's strange. When it comes to counting the money for his tea, he never makes even one mistake. But when it comes to talking, suddenly he loses his mind." My mother, like all mothers, took my side. That was when my father told us a story. He made us promise not to tell anyone about it and not to mention it to Mash Ibad either. Of course we agreed. My father said, "A while ago I went to your grandfather's grave. I was saying a prayer when I saw Ibad coming toward me. He said, 'Abbas, whenever you come here, bring me 10 or 15 turnips. I'm not feeling well.' I told him, 'Okay.' That night I filled a sack with food so I could take it to him. They had already announced the evening prayer, and I was coming back from the mosque. When I got near Ebad's room, I heard his voice getting louder. It sounded like he was arguing with someone. I became curious. I wanted to know who would visit this old man at that time of night. I knocked on the door with my key. Ebad suddenly stopped shouting, but I heard him say, 'Shh.' When he opened the door, it was as if he didn't recognize me. His eyes were red. Somehow I became frightened of him. Before he could say anything, I lifted the sack and said, 'Ibad, here are the turnips you wanted.' He grabbed the sack like a debt collector and slammed the door shut. I wanted to get angry with him, but I cursed the devil and let it go. I turned around to leave the cemetery, and suddenly he started shouting again. The next day, I saw him by the road. I wanted to act cold toward him, but he came toward me with a big smile. He thanked me repeatedly and even paid me for the turnips. So the poor man can't control himself. After hearing what my father said, my anger toward Mashibad disappeared, but I decided I wouldn't be as friendly with him as before and would stop worrying about him. 2 weeks passed. Every day when I came back from the city, he was standing under the tree, warming himself by a fire. Usually nobody stopped by the roadside to drink tea, and seeing that made me feel sorry for him. Until one day, when I was returning to the village a little later than usual, I saw Mashibad get into a car. The car drove toward the cemetery. The license plate clearly showed that it wasn't from our county. I thought to myself, who is this guy? The poor man didn't have anyone. Still, I didn't follow them. It wasn't really my business, but there was something suspicious about it. Exactly 3 days after that, something else happened. When I returned to the village, one of my neighbors, a man named Jabbar, jumped in front of my truck and said, "Come over here. Take this sacrifice meat to Ibad." Mashibad's house was a little distance away from the village. I said, "You come with me too. I'm not on good terms with him." Jabbar sighed and got into the truck. The two of us drove toward the cemetery. When we got close to Mashibad's room, I saw that same car from 3 days earlier was still there. Before I could say anything, Jabbar said, "Looks like he has a guest." I quickly nodded and said, "Looks like the guy ate the watercress and dropped anchor." I wondered how Mashibad had been putting up with this guy for 3 days. Jabbar turned toward me and asked, "How many days has he been here?" I told him that 3 days earlier I had seen Mashibad get into that car. We both fell silent and got out of the truck in front of the room. Jabbar walked up and knocked on the door. A moment later, Mashibad opened it. He greeted us happily, and after taking the sacrificial meat, he thanked us repeatedly and prayed for us. I tried to look through the gap in the door, hoping to catch a glimpse of Mashibad's mysterious guest, but I couldn't see anything. We said goodbye and walked back toward the village with Jabbar. On the way, Jabbar finally spoke. "I wish we could figure out who his guest is, but by then it was too late to think about it." After dropping Jabbar off, I headed home. As soon as I stepped inside, my father came toward me carrying a pot wrapped in cloth. When he saw me, he said, "Where were you? You're late," I said. I took Jabbar to the cemetery so he could deliver some food. As soon as my father heard that, he brought the pot forward and said, "Damn it, if I had known, I would have given you this to take." I asked, "What is it?" He said, "Lentil rice. Mashibad loves it." "Come on, take it. It will bring you blessings." I sighed and said, "Forget it, Dad. I just took half a kilo of meat to him. Don't worry, he won't go hungry." My father frowned and continued, "But son, this old man doesn't even have teeth to chew with. Who's going to cook for him at this time of night?" Suddenly, an idea started eating away at me. I said, "Let me use taking him dinner as an excuse to go back and check things out again." I asked my father to come with me, but he made an excuse saying he had just returned from the fields and was tired. Still, I took the pot and headed toward the cemetery. There was a stream crossing the entrance to the cemetery. Sometimes it was dry and sometimes it was full of water. The wheel of the Nissan fell into this stream, and no matter what I did, I couldn't get it out. It was very strange to me that the power of this vehicle wasn't enough to get it out of such a small stream. There was no choice. I had to call for help. I thought it would be better to take the food to Mashibad first, then return to the village. Holding the pot, I walked toward his room. That area was completely dark. I tried not to look at the graves. Some of them had standing gravestones, and your imagination could drive you crazy. The smell of the food was making my mouth water, and I was trying to resist stealing from it so I wouldn't betray the trust placed in me. As I got close to his room, I realized something. The room's light was on, but the car belonging to his guest was no longer in front of the door. I walked closer and knocked. Mashibad wasn't there. I looked around. Other than me and the moon in the sky, there was no one around. On top of that, an icy wind was blowing. On the left side of the room, there was a recessed section in the wall that faced directly toward the village. I thought, I'll go hide there until Mashibad and his guest show up. They'll see me, and besides, the guy has a car and could help me. As I sat there, I was exhausted. I put my head on my knees and fell asleep. I don't know how much time had passed when I woke up to the sound of someone in distress. Someone was dragging himself toward the room, grumbling. Once my senses came back, I realized it was Mashibad himself, but he was coming from the direction of the cemetery. I wanted to stand up and let him see me, but suddenly something strange came out of his mouth. I can't tell you exactly what he said, but just know that he was cursing prayers, offerings, the people who made the offerings, and everything else. For a moment, I thought to myself, that old man, whatever else he was a religious man. What kind of talk is this? I was somehow frightened of him. A moment later, he put the key in the lock, went inside the room, and slammed the door shut. I stood there completely stunned, holding that ridiculous pot beside the wall and staring at the lights of the village. It was truly a strange moment. I didn't know whether I should knock on his door or what he might do. He would probably curse me, the lentil rice, and whoever had made it. That senile old man. For a moment, I became angry and turned back toward the Nissan. On the way, so my father wouldn't find out what had happened, I ate the lentil rice rice by the handful, and I enjoyed it. When I reached the Nissan, I was about to walk past it, but suddenly I thought to myself, let me try one more time. With my first attempt, the Nissan jumped out of the stream, and we returned to the village. As soon as my father saw me, he started questioning me. What did Mashibad say? Was he happy? While pulling a single lentil out from under my lip, I said, yes, he was very happy. Poor man, he kept walking around and praying for you. My father smiled with satisfaction and gestured for me not to say anything else. That night passed, but I didn't let it go. Mashibad was the gravedigger of the village, a man who supposedly knew about the fate of human beings. Yet, what I had seen of him was completely different from the image everyone in the village had of him, so I decided to keep an eye on him. The next day, when I was returning from work, there was no sign of his car by the roadside. Using that as an excuse, I left the main road and headed toward the cemetery. The cemetery was directly to the right of the road. I stopped the truck right in front of his room. There was still about an hour before sunset. I got out of the truck and after calling out for Mashibad, knocked on the door of his room. Again, there was no answer. I wondered where the old man had gone. Suddenly, my eyes fell on the ground. There were tire tracks leading toward the desert behind the cemetery. I remembered that the night before, Mashibad had been coming from that same direction. I realized there was something going on between him and his strange guest. The path the guest's car had taken was a rough dirt road, full of potholes. I wondered how the guy had the nerve to take his car through there. I decided to follow the tire tracks on foot. The path was long. Eventually, it led to the ruins of Mazra-e-Kone. It was the place where the village had originally been built, but because of a contagious disease, it had been abandoned. I started following the tire tracks. By the time the sun had completely set and the light was fading, I reached the ruins. It had become difficult to distinguish the tire tracks. It was dark and the ground was hard. I looked around, hoping to find something. There was no sign of the car either. The weather was cold, and that made me give up very quickly. But just as I was about to turn around, I caught sight of a light in the corner of my eye. Someone had lit a lamp or a candle among the ruins. The first thought that came to my mind was that Mashibad and his guest must have found some treasure around here. My heart raced at the thought of easy money. I thought, I'll hide somewhere and wait. Once they find the treasure, I'll reveal myself. To make sure they wouldn't see me, I had to circle around the ruins. Walking among the mud, brick, and collapsed buildings gave me a terrible feeling, especially because I knew what fate most of the people who had lived there had suffered. Sometimes I could hear faint groans. It sounded as if someone was still lying sick in bed, struggling against death. Terrified and trembling, I made my way behind the ruined wall where I had seen the light. Someone was moving around. I could hear the sound of a shovel digging. I waited for 10 minutes, but not a single word was exchanged between them. I couldn't get a clear view of what was happening inside the ruins either. Suddenly my eyes fell on a hole in one of the walls. I decided that no matter what, I had to get over there and find out what was going on inside the ruins. On all fours, I crawled around the ruins until I reached a place where I could see inside. I raised my head to see how far they had gotten with their work. Suddenly, a horrible voice rang out. It sounded as if the devil himself was inside the ruins, laughing. I quickly ducked my head. When the sound stopped, I slowly raised my head again. I saw Mashibad standing on the ruins with a shovel in his hand. I was horrified by what he had dug up. I was completely stunned. Was this old man really the devil, pretending to be an angel? Mashibad, whom I was now ashamed to even call Mash, wasn't looking for treasure. He had dug a grave, and it was obvious that it was already too late. He threw a few shovelfuls of dirt onto the grave, and when he finished, he sat down beside it. He closed his eyes. I saw his body begin to tremble. It was as if some illness had taken hold of him. A moment later, he opened his eyes and stared at the grave. He gently tapped the soil with his hand and said, "Shout, beg, but no one can hear you anymore." Then he let out a drunken, hysterical laugh and slowly placed his forehead on the ground. It was as if someone had entered him, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't see anyone. Ibad lifted his head from the dirt and in a voice full of humiliation and desperation said, "That's another one. Only 2 are left." That was when I became certain that the poor man had gone insane. But that didn't mean I could hate him any less. Ibad had killed someone. I was certain that as soon as I got away from Ibad and his devilish gathering, I would report his crime to the police, who knew what condition the family of the poor person he had buried was in. The old man kept putting his head on the ground and repeating the same words in a pleading voice. Until that moment, I thought I was simply dealing with a madman, until a strange and terrifying sound echoed through through the dark alleys. It sounded as if a herd of wild bulls was coming toward us. Before I could run away in panic, a steady current of wind formed among the ruins. Something like a small tornado moved toward Ibad, and very quickly the candles inside the ruins went out. Complete darkness covered everything. I wanted to use the darkness to escape the area when a sinister sound suddenly rose into the air. It sounded like someone whose tongue had been cut out, desperately trying to scream. At the same time, Ebed spoke to it and began affectionately pleading with it. I became so terrified that my legs gave out, and I sat down right there against the wall. I wasn't feeling well. I turned my head toward the wall, and little by little I began to fall asleep. As my eyes were closing, I realized that someone was slowly approaching me from behind. I don't know exactly how much time had passed. Suddenly I became alert, and then I realized, God help me, I could no longer hear Ibad from inside the ruins. I immediately understood what kind of danger was lurking behind me. I could even hear its breathing. I didn't give myself another moment to doubt. Like a cat, I suddenly leaped forward. A sound rang out behind me, and I realized that Ebad had slammed the shovel into the ground, aiming for my head. If I had been even 1 second slower, it would have hit me. I didn't even look behind me. I started running. The old man, realizing that he could no longer reach me, began shouting and begging me to stop. I realized that he was calling for help from some others. As I ran along the path, I saw that the doors of some of the houses occasionally opened, and animals stared at me. Even though fear had gripped my throat, I didn't hesitate for a second to keep running. I didn't want to be killed in the middle of nowhere by some pathetic old man who had sold his soul, but that night I was so terrified of him that I doubt I could have defeated him if we had actually fought. It's not for nothing that they call fear the brother of death. By any means necessary, I finally made it to the desert. I could no longer hear Ibad. Somewhere along the way, someone said, "Hurry, we have to warn them." I turned my head to see who was following me. I saw no one, but in the distance, my eyes fell on a tree about 20 meters away from me. I saw someone leaning against it, a tall figure dressed entirely in one color. This was the only time I ever saw one of the beings connected to Ibad. Maybe if I hadn't seen it, I would have continued doubting whether they were actually jinn, but that strange and terrifying creature did not belong to our world. The moment I saw it, one of my legs gave out, and I fell hard onto the ground. Terror took over my entire body. I thought it was coming for me, but it simply stood there. Somehow I managed to reach my vehicle and drove back to the village. In the alley, I started screaming for help, and together with several villagers, we headed toward the ruins. Just as I had said, there was a dead person inside the grave. The villagers contacted the police. When the police searched the ruins, the story of Ibad became even darker. 3 other people, a woman, a man, and a young boy, had been buried in one of the ruins. Later, I was told that they had still been alive after they were buried. In fact, Ebad had been burying people alive. No one had any explanation for such a terrible crime. But based on the things I had heard him say, I had my own suspicions. Ebad had been a servant of the devil for a very long time, and they never found him. No one knows how an old man who could barely walk, and who was even incapable of riding a bicycle, managed to disappear so quickly. The police didn't give any importance to these stories, but the people of Mazra-e-Kone all know the story of Ibad, and they will never forget it, just like the disease that killed the people of this village many years ago. Well, tonight's story has come to an end. If you enjoyed it, you can help the channel by sharing the story with others, and don't forget to leave a like. If you have any thoughts or opinions, leave them in the comments. May God protect you, Tiger Moon.